I call the member for Grainler.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I want to join with the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition and other members on this condolence motion to a great Australian and a champion of the Australian Labor Party, Mr Neville Wran. Neville Wran was educated at Nicholson Street Public School and Fort Street Boys High School in my electorate. He went on to study law at the University of Sydney and became a prominent lawyer prior to entering the upper house of the New South Wales Parliament in 1970. In 1973, he moved to the electorate of Bass Hill. He became leader of the Australian Labor Party and was elected Premier in 1976. This was just after the very significant defeat of the Whitlam Labor government in 1975. It was a time where the Australian Labor Party was going through considerable difficulties. Neville Wran mobilised public support. Neville Wran understood that it was vital that politicians be aware of issues such as costs of living and the concerns of people in their local communities. At Neville Wran's quite extraordinary send-off at the Sydney Town Hall just a month ago, the contributions of former Prime Minister Paul Keating, former Premier Bob Carr, Justice Michael Kirby and Labor historian Rodney Cavalier, and members of Neville's family, his wife Jill and children Kim, Harriet and Hugo, were quite remarkable. In addition to that, those family members, can I also give my condolence to Glenn Wran, his son, who was the president of Ashfield branch in my electorate, of long-standing note during the time in which I have had the honour of serving in this House as a member for Grainler. I well recall the extraordinary state conference of the New South Wales ALP at Sydney Town Hall when Neville Wran announced his resignation in June 1986. As I entered the magnificent Sydney Town Hall that morning, the loyal deputy to Neville Wran, Jack Ferguson, pulled me aside and said, "Take a seat, son, you're about to see history." I didn't know at that time what was coming. We all know in this place there are very few secrets in politics. It is indeed remarkable that Neville Wran was able to resign from that high office after serving for a decade as Premier of the largest state in Australia, and it was kept a secret. The gasps from delegates at that conference was an emotional reaction that will stay with me for as long as I live. It was fitting that Neville Wran chose the floor of a New South Wales ALP conference to announce his resignation. He was of the view that no individual was greater than the movement of which they are a part. From time to time you hear that individuals might like to think they get here on their own. They don't. They get here because of the support of their family, their community and the political party to which they represent. Neville Wran, a giant of the Labor movement, never put himself above that movement. His achievements were quite remarkable. His achievements in terms of the economic transformation of New South Wales into a modern economy. In areas like infrastructure, the new railway out to the eastern suburbs, the electrification of the lines to Wollongong and to Newcastle, new infrastructure in Sydney's western suburbs, support in regional New South Wales. What that led to was the remarkable landslides in 1978 and 1981. This was a time where Labor won seats like Manly, like Willoughby, many seats in regional New South Wales as well. A two-party preferred vote of higher than 60% is something that I suspect might never be seen again. A remarkable performance. And it wasn't a performance by doing nothing. It was a performance that was an endorsement of a reforming, forward-thinking government. Reforming in terms of the great achievements on infrastructure and economic development, but also in the environment, whereby, thanks to Neville Wran, the great national parks of the north coast of New South Wales were saved and protected. He created the Land and Environment Court. He understood that development needed to be balanced with appropriate outcomes in terms of environmental protection. He rebuilt the inner areas of Sydney through the Darling Harbour project and the Sydney Entertainment Centre. The Darling Harbour project on the old sites of Pyrmont there were very controversial. The fact was that it was a dilapidated area that he subjected to urban renewal. As someone who was born and lived at the time of Neville Wran's premiership on Pyrmont Bridge Road, Camperdown, I was very familiar with that area. In terms of his other reforms, he established a Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs, and the most significant at the time land rights legislation that had occurred anywhere in Australia up to that point. He introduced the Anti-Discrimination Act. He removed the criminalisation of homosexuality. At a time where there's a modern debate about marriage equality, it is remarkable that just those few years ago, to be gay was to risk being jailed for the fact of your sexuality. Neville Wran had the courage to take that on and lead the nation and make a real difference to people's lives. In the areas of women's rights, Neville Wran was ahead of the nation again in introducing legislation, making sure in terms of appointments. Before Neville Wran's government, the idea of a woman being appointed to a court was something that was seen as being remarkable and not really appropriate. Neville Wran made sure that women were appointed to all of the highest offices in the New South Wales regime. Before Neville Wran, the Legislative Council of New South Wales was a bit like the House of Lords in the UK. They weren't elected by the people, they were appointed by each other. Neville Wran went to a referendum and won it to transform, after more than a century after the New South Wales Parliament was formed, to transform the Legislative Council into a democratic body. Neville Wran introduced public funding and disclosure laws. Pecuniary interest register for members of parliament didn't exist before Neville Wran in New South Wales. In terms of some of the laws that were still present in New South Wales before his premiership, the death penalty was still in New South Wales prior to it being abolished. The Summary Offences Act, whereby people were picked up, put into jail for the crime of being homeless or other issues of poverty, essentially, was removed. He was, of course, the longest-serving Premier of New South Wales until Bob Carr broke that record. Neville Wran was someone who I had the honour of having contact as the President of Young Labor. At the time, Young Labor wasn't always compliant with the government of the day. Neville Wran had a wit, but also a very sharp way of taking a young fellow, as I was in the Labor Party in those days, and giving us very much the benefits of his wisdom in a very direct fashion about the need to support his government. He was someone who was larger than life. He was someone who went on to have an extraordinary career in business. He was someone who was prepared to take a young fellow like myself aside and give good advice to about the Labor Party. I'm very honoured to be a member of the Australian Labor Party. Like Neville Wran, because of my membership of the Labor Party, I have enjoyed a better life and privileges that I couldn't have dreamed of when I was growing up just a few kilometres from where Neville Wran grew up and went to school in our local community. I pay tribute to him and I honour him in this Parliament today, and I conclude by once again giving my condolences to Jill, who gave such a remarkable eulogy at his farewell, and to his children and all of his friends, colleagues and comrades.